So our thoughts right now are focused on how to make the smart Arctic a reality, what it means in terms of investment, in terms of cooperation between the different sort of stakeholders involved, whether it be government, local communities, business, academia, the indigenous peoples of the region. All of them need this to happen, but we've got to discuss how it happens best. I want to get our two new speakers, whom we haven't heard from yet, involved straight away. So, Christian, I'll actually start with you. I love Trevor's presentation because here he was talking about cutting-edge technology, which was being very sort of cleverly introduced to indigenous peoples who can use that technology, but in a way which makes it entirely relevant to them and user-friendly for them to be actively involved in from the very beginning. In a way, I'm looking at you as Director General of the Norwegian Space Center and thinking, my goodness, how can what you're doing be used by communities to make them smarter and more adaptable in the Arctic North when, you know, your mind is on matters many, many miles above us, not actually here on planet Earth. So you explain how you can be relevant.
Okay. Thank you very much. Well, satellite technology is inherently global. The satellites need to orbit Earth, otherwise they will fall down. That means that they will provide global coverage, and that is an advantage. You could really select which areas that you would like to focus on, literally. Depending on what type of system, number of satellites, and so forth, you could actually cover very remote areas very efficiently. In terms of socioeconomic image of that, it can replace very expensive land-based infrastructure. So part of the policy that applies for developing such system for the High North is actually to look at what is the cost of land-based infrastructure, how could that be supplemented or replaced by space-based infrastructure. That is an important element of the current development of a national space strategy in Norway. And in fact, the government's Arctic strategy mentions explicitly the use of satellites in terms of monitoring of maritime activities, offshore activities, to provide a more safe and efficient way of doing maritime operations. That's just one example. Mm-hmm. So, in terms
also
of
monitoring of ice and ice flows and
ice
melts.
Of oil spills, of ship traffic,
yeah.
In particular. And in that regard, Norway has been very successful in terms of developing very cost-efficient small satellites, which can be launched to provide specific data that are relevant for Norway. But since these data are inherently global, they can also be traded. So trading of satellite data is important in order to be able to cover remote areas. Norway is very sparsely populated, of course, with very, very large areas in the ocean. The ocean area is on the order of 5 times the land area of Norway. So the strategic issue of having good coverage of the activities in the High North has been an issue since the onset of the Cold War. Now it's more on friendly and peaceful activities. So, and that is a way where, through international collaboration, these systems tend to be quite expensive. So Norway's participation in the European Space Agency and the European space programs with Earth observation, navigation, satellite communication is extremely important because then we're part of a larger community. However, some of those systems, they cover poorly in the High North, and that's where the national agenda comes in. So if we can develop jointly with other polar nations, how can we develop a satellite system that provides additional coverage in the High North, in the Arctic? Then we can obtain something in order to support smart societies.
How good is the information sharing between the Arctic nations' respective space agencies?
Actually, it's quite good in the sense that Norway is buying data. The Ministry of Climate has done a great example now where these type of data actually are becoming available commercially. Previously, they were purely governmental programs. Now they can buy that, and in the national budget, they're actually buying that for this case for monitoring of tropical forests. But you could do the same thing for surveillance of Arctic regions.
Right.
And that is part of sort of a joint global effort in order to provide the satellite infrastructure, provide smart technologies, in order to share the data and hedge on the resources, because these are important or expensive systems.
No, absolutely. I mean, that's very encouraging to know that this new sort of data flow can be shared, and that it's going to be of great immediate use to communities on the ground long after you've gathered the information from the satellites up there in the high atmospheres.
That's right. So you need to look at the return on investment, and to see what is the payback for doing these investment in that type of infrastructure. We're seeing now one specific example. These small AIS satellites, autonomous identification systems, they can monitor ship traffic. Very successful. They've been in operation for about 8 years. We're now seeing that the technology going in there, developed by Norwegian companies jointly with research labs, can also be applied for Internet of Things applications. So we're looking at, can we establish satellite constellations where we actually can provide Internet of Things signals in order to monitor in remote area, sparsely populated, to do that digitalization that we're actually looking for. So very promising.
You're in danger of losing me at this point. What exactly do you mean when you say we're now developing this Internet of Things in the High North? What do you mean?
I mean that we are in international collaboration investigating the possibility of using satellites to pick up radio signals from equipment on the ground. For instance, containers. You need to track containers on international shipping. Where are they? You need to monitor the status of specific items that are located remotely where you cannot easily get to them. You can transmit those data through satellite links and to control stations, operation centers, wherever the decision makers may be.
Okay. Right. Well, I hang on a second. I want to introduce the speaker we haven't heard from yet, James Ford. And James, the danger is we all sound so optimistic on a panel like this. We're all talking about different technological achievements and new data flows and how we're all getting much smarter and this is all going to benefit the communities of the High North. Just how optimistic are you? I think I'm right in saying you were one of the lead authors of an Arctic Council research project on adaptation actions for a changing Arctic. So you've dug deep into this. How optimistic are you about the capacity of this region, of the High North, to adapt and become smart at speed?
Well, I've been working with Inuit communities across the Nunavut for the last 15 or so years, looking how climate change impacts communities and how communities respond. And communities are actually quite resilient to change, and they're adapting in a variety of ways to the transformational changes that we're seeing. And technology is really central to that. So we see communities using satellite phones, GPS, satellite beacons. Some communities are even using drones to get real-time data on ice conditions to help them, understand if it's safe to go on those routes. So we're seeing technology autonomously being used by communities to respond to change, very much driven from the bottom up. We're also seeing indigenous knowledge systems also evolving to frame how people interact with the rapidly changing climate. So there are some good news stories. It's not all pessimistic, but there are limits to that resilience. And certainly, the speed of climate change is a major issue. We have a lot of concern about how a variety of wildlife species might be affected by climate change, species that are central to subsistence-based hunting. We also have concerns about some of the human drivers of change. And I hear again and again across communities in the Inuit North that some of the important land skills are not being translated or transferred to younger generations. Skills essential for using the environment safely and responding to change. And technology, while on the one hand is very, very important, can also create new vulnerabilities, and to some extent is a double-edged sword. It can alter risk perceptions. It can increase risk-taking behavior. Not everyone has access to technology. Things like satellite phones, GPS, they aren't cheap. Not everyone can afford them. So it's a mixed picture.
Well,
I'm optimistic, but there are challenges.
Right, that last point I want to pick up on, because I don't know if you were all able to follow one of our earlier panel discussions, but we were talking about the importance of the internet and the information flows to communities in the north, and it was pointed out that actually, despite the fact the internet obviously has reached the High North, when we're talking about 4G and 5G and the absolute cutting edge speed of the systems now available, south of here, they're not reaching the high north. So in some ways, although the high north has the internet, the differential between what it has and its potentiality and what people in Oslo or in southern communities have is actually growing. The difference is actually increasing, which is worrying for people up here. So I just wonder, and anybody can take this on who wants to, but are we in danger of being a little sort of Panglossian, a little over-optimistic about the degree to which, for example, Sam talks about, smart cities, we have smart city networks in Asia, and I want to see, coordination with smart city networks in the High North. Frankly, the High North doesn't have Singapore-style cities, and it probably never will have. So are we getting a little ahead of ourselves here?
I can respond to this quickly, and certainly bandwidth is obviously a huge issue, especially in the Canadian Arctic, where internet is very, very slow. But I think one thing we don't look at is actually access within communities. Who has access to a computer? Who has access to the internet? Who has the access to technology? And often that breaks down along existing social gradients of those who have access to resources, who have jobs and money, and those who don't. So it's not just a case of bandwidth, it's also a case of access within communities too.
Okay. Sam, you bring a perspective from a city-state, an extraordinarily successful place, which is hugely efficient and on the cutting edge of...
Maybe just over too efficient.
Well, let's not be modest. I mean, it's an extraordinary achievement what Singapore has done in the last 60 years. But do you seriously come here with your boots on and think that you can teach lessons, or that there are relevant sort of links to be made, connections to be made between what you've achieved in Singapore and what communities in the High North can hope to do?
Well, let me take a step back to put the things in perspective. Well, Singapore is a very, very small country. We have no natural resources. And 50 over years ago, we were kicked out from a federation, and overnight we suddenly became independent. So life was very hard. Future seems to be very bleak. And the only way that we think can make the country progress and also put food on the table, give people a job, is through innovation. So we had gone through a very difficult nation-building path to come to what we are today. So suddenly, over the long periods of nation-building, actually not long, 50 over years, we have learned how to be humble. So we don't think that what our experience and the progress that we have made can be replicated wholesale in different parts of the world. If we were to be so arrogant that we think our solutions will help the Arctic to become much smarter, then I wouldn't have worn a pair of boots. These are the boots that indigenous people who have been wearing for tens of thousands of years. It's not technology, it's wisdom. So what I bring to the table here is what we have experienced through our digital revolution and the development, and the examples and experiences that we have come across, and the products that we have through intensive investment in R&D to materialize, and we want to put on the table to share with like-minded counterparts that these are the possible options that you may want to consider. And in the process, in return, we also learn a lot from our counterparts, whether Arctic scientists, indigenous leaders, policy makers like ministers, and also people like you who always ask very provocative actions to make sure that we think deeply before we answer. So in a nutshell, is that I think nobody has got a total perfect solutions to address all the issues, problems, challenges facing the Arctic and also the Arctic people. But if we can come together through constructive engagement, sharing experiences and all that, then I think we will be able to move forward to make Arctic a better place. And by nature, I'm an optimist. So I look at my glass as half filled rather than half empty.
Yeah, well, you'd be wrong because it's actually more than half empty. But
yeah,
anyway,
no. So I will request for the topping up so that we will be able to have more.
But listen, I want to have a big picture thought, and any of you feel free to contribute. I think we heard earlier that the Arctic population as a whole, across all of the nations, is between 4 and 6 million, and nobody's prepared to put quite a precise number on it. But as we are talking about a planetary population, which is going to rise from the current, close to 7 billion to upwards of 9 billion or more by 2050, where does an increased population sit in a discussion of the future of the Arctic and a smart carbon, hopefully zero carbon Arctic, but certainly a very low emissions Arctic? Do you see that developing the Arctic does need population inflows, greater population numbers in the Arctic, or is that not a part of your vision of where the Arctic is going over the next 30, 40 years? And I'll start with you, Minister, because governments are supposed to think in strategic terms like this, so what are your thoughts?
We need development, of course, also in the Arctic, to attract people here.
Do you want the Norwegian Arctic to see its population rise and rise significantly?
If you look in this city, definitely, Tromsø is growing. I think that is a good thing. We will think the same thing in Finnmark and other parts of northern parts of Norway, definitely. And I'm quite sure that it should be the goal, and it's possible. Because if you look at Arctic communities, yes, they're often small, but they are also the ones that have the first great impact of global change. And it should be a goal for us that they should also be in the forefront on showing how we can mitigate global warming. I think that is a good thing. I think it also has if we can manage it, I think it gives a greater impact also to the world than the size by itself.
So are you therefore, if you want the Arctic to be a leader in that sense, are you prepared to disproportionately invest in the high north?
I think when we look at mitigation, if you look here at Tromsø, I think no one here thinks that they are anything behind any other city in Norway, definitely. But you have some areas where you need the government. As I mentioned in my talk, in Norway, we are leading the world on electric cars. 30% sales last year. But for that change to continue in the north, of course, the government has to take a greater responsibility to have the charging network. That will not happen by itself. And you will find other issues and other areas where you need a government to take responsibility to make sure that you have the same development possibilities, and you also have a level playing field for the industry.
And are you saying that you want that to happen, or that is happening?
I'm working on that to happen. That's my responsibility. So that's definitely something I'm doing.
These are phrases that are very vague. When you're working on it, are you? I
think I'm doing good. And a lot of people.
You're very good at giving yourself a very good report. I'd like other people to give
definitely.
you a report too. So we'll get to that later. We can decide whether we agree with you that you're doing good. But the thing is, you have to fight. You have to fight. I don't know, your finance minister. You have to fight other regions of the country who think that they need more investment. This is not straightforward.
No, but at the same time, with the seriousness of the situation, now I'm thinking everyone has to take in how fast this change has to come. So it is a change that we must reach in the next 12 years. So it is for me a responsibility to push it forward with the possibilities and the power that I have. What I think, though, is the difficult part is to look at the changes in nature because of global warming. If you look at it here, if you look at the fish stocks and how cods are moving northward, what impact those changes will have is what is really the difficult part and what is difficult to foresee how we should meet. And that, because the technological development, yes, I'm quite sure we can make sure that Arctic communities can be in the forefront, just as everyone else also can be. It's a responsibility, it takes action, but it's possible. But the greater changes, the changes in nature, will be more difficult to face.
Let's talk. I'm going to open it up in just a second, but that's final thought from me. Let's talk specifically about jobs, because jobs is a huge issue in the high north, making sure that there are good jobs and jobs that are sustainable into the long term for young people in the high north, so they don't have to leave this region to make their economic futures. In this sort of smart future we're all talking about and envisaging, is there going to be sufficient jobs generation in the north? And what kind of jobs are we talking about in this decarbonized world and smart world that we're talking about? What are the jobs going to be? Who has thoughts on this or hopes?
Well, certainly Smart Ice is thinking about that in the fact of training youth in the operation of technology, not just to be doing those menial tasks of camp cook or bear monitor. They're actually there being the scientist. I think we have to remember when we think of these larger issues that, and especially when your last question about increasing population in the north, for Inuit communities in Canada, which is seen as obviously one of the better places to live in the world, the social inequality between Inuit living in communities in the north versus people in the south, and even with non-Inuit in their own communities, the distance between the amount of housing, so how long they live, their mental health, their food security, all of these things, there's an incredible gap
I've witnessed it.
that needs to be filled before. In other words, you need to feed people so they're not hungry. Then you can start making them think about these larger questions. And I think this comes down to self-determination. We heard about this morning, giving a voice to people, addressing community priorities. Let me give you an example. Canada has its own radar satellite system called RadarSat, just like in Europe, and it covers the Arctic. It specializes in covering the Arctic. And the Canadian Ice Service makes ice maps, but they don't make them in the wintertime because there's no shipping in the winter in the Arctic. Right? But people are living there, people are traveling on that ice for 10 months of the year. So it's only now when Inuit have said, we want to have this information as ice is changing, are they starting, the Canadian Ice Service is working with Smart Ice to create the maps at the proper spatial and temporal scale that addresses local concerns, not the concerns of international shipping passing through the Arctic.
Okay. I think it's... go on. Yeah, Christian, go on, and then we'll open it up.
Yeah, you challenged how can we continue to develop these sparsely populated areas and create meaningful jobs. I mean, it's a reality that things are changing. Fisheries changing, fisheries moving farther north. Norway is investigating the possibility of doing further offshore exploration. It was mentioned the challenges also in Alaska of changing in the tundra and the permafrost and so forth. So using technology has been mentioned several times, that technology should be viewed as an enabler for increasing the population, creating jobs, and so forth. For instance, in Norway, building out critical infrastructure in remote areas, there has now been established a database based on radar data, where Norway is covered by 2 billion data points, where you could actually measure changes in the landscape with a resolution of millimeters. So in terms of how to cope with those challenges, where you have increased possibilities of landslides, of avalanches, of changing terrain, that's where you can apply smart people with local knowledge using these systems for developing, how they can develop the infrastructure in order to support taking advantages of those changes that are actually happening.
Just a thought for any or all of you, and Minister, you might just want to have a brief word on this. When we talk about the smart future of the Arctic, and we talk about essentially the ambition of the world to deliver a decarbonized economy by 2050, is there any place for continued fossil fuel exploration and extraction in these visions of smartness and decarbonization?
Well, that's the two challenges that Norway have. I mean, being an oil and gas producing country, at one hand, we want to lead on lowering our own emissions. I think we are in the forefront when it comes to transportation. We have a lot of international ambition, whether it's rainforests, whether it's also renewables also there. But we need to transform our economy.
And you need to leave your fossil fuels in the ground.
We know that oil and gas will become a smaller part of our economy. It's a discussion, the risk of investments in how fast that will happen. But it is also a transition that we have to go through. It is not that easy to say that it's just to stop. It is a transition because we have to make an economic
but the speed of the
transition.
transition matters. I mean, when you sit around the cabinet table with the Prime Minister and the Minister of Energy and the Minister of Finance, I'm guessing your clout doesn't match theirs.
Everyone here knows that we have had strong discussions about the Lofoten, Vesterålen area, where there's no oil exploration. There's also other discussions in Norway on this. And I really think that the world is in such a serious situation that it's not really about who is most to blame. Is it the producers or the users? We all have to change. Other parts of the world have to cut their emissions. That will affect also the producers, and producers also have to prepare for a situation where it's a smaller part of the economy. But we need an economy to change.
Yeah.
We need that green shift, and that also takes time. And in Norway's case, I also think it's important that a lot of the companies that today are in the oil and gas business has to be also part of the change. As you see with Equinor and their floating windmills, that they are also developing.
Yeah,
it's a more complicated story to make that transition.
I don't doubt it is complicated, and it is about adaptation, but it's partly about the speed, the urgency with which you're doing these things. So it's interesting just to get a sense from you of how urgent it is, or not. You're right, good. Okay, enough of me. Let's quickly get some hands up and some comments, questions from the audience. There's a lady over there. So you go ahead, ma'am.
Hello, I'm Frida from Tromsø. I'm invited here as a young ambassador, and I hear that you talk a lot about developing communities, new infrastructure, and you want us to have more babies and the population to grow. But it's something that we have to remember, that biodiversity is also important, and not only the climate. So when you're building infrastructure, you're eating up nature, which is very important in the Arctic. And also, we need to reduce our consumption.
Right.
So I cannot see that technology is not always the solution. And when talking about jobs for people in the Arctic, when you're doing the region together, Finnmark and Troms, we get less work opportunities in Finnmark when we're finished with education. And also, people who want to continue with reindeer herding or get fishing quotas, young people, that's very difficult. So I'm asking Ola Elvestuen first and foremost, how can you help meet the young people's needs in the Arctic?
That was not a small question.
No, but it was a good one. And have you got a good answer?
Do I have a good answer? No, I think here, as in the rest of Norway, of course, we have to focus on education, even though education is not enough. I think what we have developed also here in Tromsø, and the thinking of Tromsø as a capital of the Arctic is a good thing, but it cannot only be development in Tromsø. We also have to think, how can that also be added on to have development also in the smaller communities, and especially in the east of Finnmark, which is one area where we need to get better results that we have had in the past. But it's not. I do not have the one answer to how to develop it. Maybe I also think when I think about the smart Arctic, we should. It has through the decades been too much of thinking about extraction of resources. And maybe in the future we have to think more also here, a broader view than just extraction of resources. That is about the knowledge that we can develop on, that we can be part of also the resource efficiency. This has also been part of the circular economy, and all the new thinking has been part of this here too. But I do not have a better answer than that.
Yeah, Fran, I wanted you to bring your Alaska experience to bear on this as well.
So in answer, part of the answer to the question you've raised is, how do local people who already are in the North get the most benefit from the potential economic development that comes, like it or not? And one of the expressions we've used in Alaska is, we want to grow our own nurses and teachers and engineers through our university system, through improving our education system as best we can. Under the theory that, yes, there will be people who will come to Alaska, who will come to the Arctic, and that's fine, we're not closing the doors. But we want to make sure that to the extent we can, we are investing in the people who have already made the North their home, and who for generations, or in the case of indigenous people, centuries and perhaps millennia, have not only made it their home, but never want to leave. So I think part of it is an educational strategy, part of it is investing in the kind of businesses that allow for import substitution, frankly. I think that's one of the things that the North can do much better than many areas in the North have. That is, in terms of making use of our own resources, both food, water, electricity, etc. And finding ways to do that that don't necessarily involve simply growing populations.
All right.
I think we will grow populations,
Do you?
by the way, because I think places like Tromsø and Anchorage are going to see people who are leaving places like Arizona that run out of water, or places where, frankly, it gets so hot that they don't want to live there anymore. So I think if you look 30 or 40 years from now, it's not a matter of trying to encourage it. I think it will happen because it will be a very livable place. We have water, we have better temperature, we have fish, we have berries. We have many of the things, frankly, that improve quality of life in terms of opportunities for the out of doors.
Interesting thought. I promised with my eyes a question to the lady there, and I shouldn't have done because it's coffee break time. But madam, if you promise me this is going to be really brief, we'll hear.
My name is Anne Husbekk. I'm rector at the University of Tromsø, the Arctic University of Norway. And I think a university is part of the answer to the question, because a university will both attract young people who stay in the area. We have proven that for 50 years. 70% of our students stay in the area. 17% of our students come from abroad. They stay also.
Do they?
Those coming from the south of Norway tend to go back, but we don't matter. They are needed in
You
the
mean
south
your
of Norway.
international students, they like it
tend
and
to
they stay?
They tend to stay. I think that we have a lot of opportunities in the North. We have been a net exporter of resources for hundreds of years. We send our fish to China, for instance, for processing and ship it back for eating it. We can do a lot with fish resources, with seafood resources, with aquaculture. We can grow vegetables from electricity that we have 100% more of than we use in the north of Norway. So we are talking about data storage center. We should grow vegetables in the north. We can do a lot of things with the electricity. And being attractive, we will attract people from other parts of the world to the north, and we need them, everyone.
I love it. We're going to end with, I'm sorry, I'm not taking any more comments. I'm going to end with a really wonderfully positive, upbeat message. So it can happen. The North can be smart, it can be adaptive, it can be resilient, and there can be more people here too.